I think we left off at the Alien and Seditious Acts, if I'm correct. Part of that omnibus package is really popular today. The Aliens Exclusion Act, it's part of the omnibus package here. We can talk about that later. I'm not going to talk about that so much now. But it was a curtailment, obviously, of the First Amendment, allowing for imprisonment of peoples who spoke out, particularly Democratic Republicans who spoke out against the Adams administration. I want to jump back just very quickly again on these different perceived ideas of the role of the executive branch that these different groups had as well. Adams, when titles were being considered for the president, wanted the president to be called His Excellency or His Majesty. Again, very much in the vein of a monarch, very much believed in a strong unitary executive branch, which is actually quite popular in conservative movements today. So he very much believed in that. Adams and Jefferson laughed about it, especially because they knew he had aims to be president, and they're like, "You're just some dude from Braintree. What are you doing, man? And we're all kind of backwater of the British Empire anyways. What are we all doing?" And that there is Joe reminded me of this, and I wanted to talk about a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, just very briefly. I think it's one of the most beautiful and eloquent things written. I don't have it memorized, unlike some people here. Obviously primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson, who was its main editor, and the person who added the most to it, aside from Jefferson, was John Adams. Adams did inherently believe in unalienable rights that applied to all peoples. And Madison and Jefferson kind of threw that back in his face when he talked about His Excellency or His Majesty. He said, the president shits the same way we do. The king shits the same way we do. We are all equal before the law. And that's why, and I talked about this a little bit in my last talk, but that's why this idea of impeachment became so powerful, to impeach the king, the executive. Obviously, this all started back in Magna Carta, but this was a very powerful idea of a curtailment and a checks and balances system to keep the government from being too oppressive even within itself. There's sort of a dual dichotomy. 10th Amendment gives all powers not granted herein to the states. And that's one balancing act, state sovereignty versus the limited Constitution, the first, second, and third articles that limit actually what role each branch can play. The Supreme Court might be the interpretation of the Constitution when a law is passed, but they can only see cases in controversy. They can't just opine about whether or not a new law is constitutional or not. A case has to be brought up through the system, from a trial court to the Supreme Court, and only then can they rule on it. And it has to be a case they can actually see, has to have what's called standing. Someone has to actually have been injured by it. So the Supreme Court might be the final interpretation of the Constitution, but it has to get there, and they have a very narrow lane. Congress makes those laws. It's supposed to make them constitutional. We can debate whether or not they always do, and a number of times it gets struck down, but they're supposed to do that. And the president is supposed to execute those laws. That's what those agencies of alphabet soups are for. So when we pass the Alien and Seditious Act, which is unconstitutional, you have somebody like the FBI or CIA or whomever enforcing that act. That's where these agencies come from, is to enforce the President's Act. A problem we'll talk about later, which the founders did not anticipate, was agencies making their own laws, what's called rulemaking, where ATF and FBI now have different laws and enforce them differently, and they say it's within congressional scope. This is some of my own works that I go off on a tangent on. I won't talk about those now, but there's a lot of criticism of rulemaking in general that these agencies have. But so these acts are passed, and Adams obviously uses it. He helped write the Declaration of Independence, adopts the Constitution, does not believe in really religious diversity or diversity of thought at all. He's a little more lenient on diversity of peoples. And he happens to get Jefferson's friend, who happens to just be the biggest newspaper writer for the Democratic Republicans, in jail. So that's one of Adams' biggest thing. And later, Jefferson will become president. His very first act is actually to repeal the Alien Seditions Act. But now I want to jump to Madison. Madison is working as Secretary of State for Jefferson when he's president. Thomas Jefferson is our third president of the United States. And Madison is actually somehow figures out about Napoleon's and really Talleyrand's. Talleyrand is the foreign minister for the French. Probably one of the most brilliant people of that time. Crazy man, absolutely crazy man, power hungry fiend. He loved Machiavelli. Keep a copy, and he really believed in it, and he was very successful. Also came from almost nothing to end up being Napoleon's really left-hand man in a lot of things. And Madison finds out through the grapevine and through Talleyrand, through bribes, that the French are bankrupt entirely. The French don't have their own centralized bank, and they're entirely bankrupt. And they've been taking out loans from the Vatican and from everybody's taking money from the Dutch at this time. The Dutch are the financiers of Europe for the most part. The French can't take out any money from the British for obvious reasons. And Madison thinks, well, this might be an opportunity. And he goes to Jefferson. Says, they have no money and they have all this land and they control the port rights to one of the most important ports in the United States, New Orleans. And they also have all this other territory. We don't really care as much about that. We really care about West Florida, is what it's called at the time. But maybe we can get a good deal. And so Jefferson and Napoleon engage in these talks, really through Talleyrand and Madison. And we end up in probably the best purchase of all time for almost no money, for millions of acres of land, fertile land, important trade land, all because the French are bankrupt. Not through any really big ingenious, and actually we were talking about before gossip about what the founders would throw at each other. Madison and Jefferson really found part of this through Talleyrand's gossip. So they're able to do one of the greatest purchases of all time, expanding the United States. Many of you will later know the Monroe Doctrine about settling the rest of the United States. But it's a very interesting to see the correspondence between Madison and Jefferson at this time. They believed what they were doing was unconstitutional. That they did not have the power to do this, and they were absolutely right. They did not have the power to do this, but they did it anyways. And Congress was none the wiser. The Supreme Court did not really seem to care very much about this, and we ended up doubling the size of the United States for not that much money, money that we partially borrowed from the Dutch, and it was pretty amazing, unconstitutional as hell, and it's very interesting if you read Madison's own diaries about it. He tosses and turns. Remember, he's the architect of the Constitution, and it happens to be flexible when it needs to be for him. It's sort of a moral of many presidents who passed through Pennsylvania Avenue. So Madison next becomes our president. Madison has to do a lot of lobbying. He's the dwarf man. He's not as compelling or as attractive of a figure as Thomas Jefferson. There is a little bit of Madison did fight in the war. He was really more of a secretary, but much like Hamilton, but he did fight. You have to remember that Adams and Jefferson were sort of lambasted for their not fighting. I mean, Jefferson unfairly is maligned as giving up Virginia when he's governor during the Revolution. Adams does not. He obviously serves in Congress and is a very prominent figure. Madison is able to use this idea of that he's a vet to help get him into office. He's able to get the Virginia bourgeois behind him, and he's able to convince New York and Pennsylvania, who are the most important swing states. I mean, them along with Virginia are the most important states. And so Madison comes into power, and he actually comes in, he rides a bit high because of the Louisiana Purchase, because of the success of Thomas Jefferson, What Madison does not realize when he gets in, and him and Jefferson neglected this, was relations with Britain. Many of you probably know the War of 1812. We are really taken by surprise about how powerful the Canadian British forces are and how shittily we do against them. They end up burning down the original White House and destroying D.C. And they joke about it. A lot of critiques of Madison is, oh, you've made yourself out to be a veteran and you lost the capital to the British, who burned it down. Like so much for that war experience that you have. And that actually lives with Madison the rest of his life. And it's a particularly stingful memory for him that he'll write about in his diaries. So Madison, at the end, Jefferson fights the Bourbon pirates a little bit, but Madison, after this, I won't say defeat, but we'll call it a pretty damn close to defeat draw with the British. Remember, Jackson wins New Orleans after the war's over. We had already signed unfavorable terms. Had there been, and this is no fault of Madison by any means, but had he waited until Jackson had a resounding victory in New Orleans, we probably would have been a real draw or pretty close to a victory. But he didn't, and we signed unfavorable terms. And Madison began moving more toward a centralized power. Remember, Madison was a democratic republic. He kind of moved a little bit to help with the ratification of the Constitution, but he realized the United States would ultimately fail if it did not have a strong central government. We would be invaded by foreign powers, we'd be taken over by foreign powers. We needed to have a strong economic power and a strong military power, and he actually really began building our Navy. Monroe will take this over and actually start building a really strong army, especially after the Monroe Doctrine and the expansion westward, and he'll start making a very strong beginnings of a military. But Madison, it was one of his biggest regrets and limitations, the performance of the War of 1812. And there's actually a really beautiful correspondence that begins less with Madison, but really with Adams and Jefferson after this time, after Madison's presidency. Madison is really Monroe is actually the last of these founding father presidents, but Madison is the end of the Jefferson dynasty, really, as we know it. There's Democratic Republicans, and there's a beautiful dialogue back and forth between them. Madison and Hamilton will have this, where they admit that they were at each other's throats. Actually, these letters do not start so nice. The first thing is Adams sends a letter to Jefferson and says, and obviously he didn't say it quite like this, but like, look at that, your protege was such a fucking failure, and walks out. Madison was not an utter failure. I mean, he actually helped modernize the country a lot and passed a lot of strong reforms and things that helped our nation. But nonetheless, Adams would take any dig he could at the Democratic Republicans and vice versa. And just know when Adams left administration, they were just as cruel to him. Calling him a loser. Adams lost for the second election when he lost against Jefferson. Actually, famously, partially because of Hamilton, who threw part of his weight behind Jefferson, which is crazy to think that could happen. I mean, today I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm not a part of those inner circles. It would be wild to see, J.D. Vance break off and support Kristen Sinema so that way she could become a president. I just don't think you don't see that kind of bipartisan, what's best for the country. Also, though, Hamilton secretly, not so secretly then, but really disliked Adams on a personal level, not even as much on a political one. Just thought he was an asshole, and a lot of people did. So they were very mean to one another. But there's this eventual reconciliation that happens. John has 3 sons. One of them, very famously, John Quincy Adams, who wildly is actually a Democratic Republican and ends up serving in Madison's administration and later becomes president. But Adams ends up realizing that these people aren't quite the devil. And Adams is the one who actually extends the first olive branch to be amicable. And truthfully, I would be remiss if I did not say, actually, the lady behind him was so important to the United States, that Abigail Adams was so important to the U.S. and the Adams administration, particularly with entertainment of foreign diplomats and understandings. She, at her pushing, got John to write to Jefferson. And then later, there would be correspondence amongst others. And she also was a fierce thinker about maintaining the neutrality, which obviously Jefferson and Madison at the time when Adams was president and when Washington was president were vehemently opposed to. I mean, they were very, very pro-French. And she did a magnificent job of helping steer the Adams administration toward neutrality. And she's not one that's really talked about very often. She was very brilliant. She was educated, deeply, devoutly religious, much like John. And they had the three sons, and John Quincy Adams would later be president. They had another son, Thomas, who also was a lawyer and an alcoholic. He moved back home to Braintree, where Adams retired to be a farmer, and he ended up dying at a young age. The Adams family had a pretty horrible personal life. And John started writing basically a lot of philosophical work and treatises, which Jefferson and Madison both enjoyed. At a certain point, they were really impressed by it. Everybody was impressed. John was a good writer. But John had a really horrible personal life. I mean, his relationship with his wife was wonderful, but his kids, aside from John Quincy Adams, who was never home, they both died from alcoholism. And he became really depressed. And it was really beautiful. You know, Jefferson at first is writing angrily to disagree politically with Adams, and then they kind of bond. I mean, Jefferson's loss of his wife, and then the loss of his daughter. When Jefferson's daughter died in pregnancy, Jefferson was very distraught. It's actually an episode of a mailman coming to deliver something to Jefferson after his daughter died, and the mailman writes, a postmaster, which back then actually was a big deal. The postmaster writes that there was this 6-foot redhead asshole, basically, who answered the door and screamed at me. I thought a president was supposed to be a titan, a wonderful person. He said Jefferson was a complete animal. And Jefferson and Adams, mostly through Abigail, bonded over this shared hardship, personal hardship that really hit them. And they ended up becoming friends. And this is something that I think is really beautiful that Adams ends up accepting. They aren't the same faith. They aren't even the same lineage. There's obviously a mix there, but they don't have shared ideas at all. But they end up sharing something that looks a lot like friendship and brotherhood that beats all of these, which is really, I think, quite beautiful in a tale of America, which leads us to our next part, which is what I'll coin the second founding of America, which is extremely monumental. And I want to talk, the same way I talked about Adams and Madison, I want to talk about James Longstreet and Ulysses S. Grant. Two also titans who were super, super important. I'm going to start with Longstreet. James Longstreet was born in South Carolina to a moderately wealthy plantation family. He is educated in Augusta, Georgia, where he goes to a military academy, and he performs mediocrely. He lives with his aunt and uncle, and he ends up getting to West Point, not through Georgia. The family cannot afford to, I don't want to say corrupt, but get the Georgia congressman to sign him for West Point. So they use Longstreet's aunt's maternal line to get him as an Alabama appointee. So you have a by birth South Carolinian man who identifies as a Georgian and who grew up in Georgia and really is a product of Georgia, being Alabama's representative at West Point. And he goes up there and he again does really mediocrely. Nothing special about Longstreet. He's a rich kid who doesn't do well, who gets in fights with people, who's a little bit of an asshole to people. The thing they write about him and where he meets Grant is at West Point's library, reading what would effectively be comic books. The two of them meet and become best friends. So let's jump to Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was actually born into a working class, more impoverished family in Ohio. And Grant's family, his father jumped around to all different jobs. So it was a blacksmith, carpenter, tailor for a time. And Grant his parents are very religious, deep abolitionists, very much disagree with slavery, very, very religious. They let Grant has an affinity for memorizing the Bible. Something a president who appoints him also has a deep affinity about. And Grant's family and town save up money to send him to school. They realize that he's very smart. They actually exempt him from going to church 3 times a week. They let him stay at home and read the Bible instead, which is miraculous for such a religious family at the time. And they send Grant to a town in southern Ohio to become educated. And Grant is the top of his class. And he particularly excels in athleticism, which he's actually, Longstreet is a 6-foot Southern gentleman. Grant is 5'8", a little bit on the heavier set side, but exceptionally strong and a great athlete. Grant is top of his class there, and he ends up getting a bid to go to West Point through his own merits, not as much through corruption. Grant gets to West Point and fucking hates it. Absolutely hates it. He thinks that they are totalitarians. He says this is baloney that I have to wake up at 5:30 and go marching. I don't like taps. I don't know if taps existed, the song, yet. He doesn't like any of it, and Grant actually does very mediocrely there as well, shockingly so. He is the best horseman in his class, though, which is odd because he actually will not be assigned to the cavalry, which is very weird that happens. Normally that would not. He was top of his class for horse. And these two were in class together. And they used to call Grant Sam. They called him Sam because somebody messed up on his paperwork. Remember, Grant was not from a wealthy family that could help him. And the congressman thought his name was U.S. Grant. And he thought the S was, they didn't know if it was a joke or what. They thought it might be Uncle Sam, which that idea did exist by then. They were like, we don't know what it stands for. They started calling him Sam. And Longstreet and him become fast friends. Yeah.
What was his actual middle name?
Yeah.
Simpson?
Yeah. So he ends up there, and he and Longstreet become very fast friends. Sorry, 1 second. And let me just check out what we're doing on time. Take a few more minutes. Become fast friends. They're both mediocre in their class, and they graduate. Grant is actually sent into infantry, which is wild because he wasn't good at it. I don't know why they didn't put him in cavalry. It makes no sense to me. I don't know. But they end up serving together, they get stationed together, and actually later, Grant will end up marrying Longstreet's cousin in Missouri. And there's a great reckoning that Grant has. His Longstreet's cousin Longstreet comes from a slaveholding family. And Grant inherits from this marriage a slave. And Grant wrestles with this himself and is actually quite anti-slavery. But Grant, after he's released from the military, and I'll talk about his military service in a minute, is economically destitute and doesn't know what to do. So he ends up having 2 slaves. One is a direct gift from his father-in-law and one through an inheritance from his wife. The one from his father-in-law he actually frees the minute he gets him. And he and Longstreet have a correspondence, and Longstreet's pissed. He's like, why don't you just at least sell him or let him save up money to buy his freedom? It's like, even if you'd only done it for $100. Grant says, I just can't do it. He says, God did not intend this to be the way. And Grant wrestles with himself about it because he's not even from a moral standpoint, but he says, I feel like I'm failing my family. And there's a big thing. He feels like he's not a man. Grant at this time is deeply alcoholic. He's sent to the western frontiers after these two actually served together in the Mexican-American War under Lee and under Scott. And again, they end up still being fast friends, but they are sent to different places. Longstreet is sent to Texas, an outpost there, and Grant is sent up to the western states, Mountain West, and Grant is really depressed that he no longer has any friends. He no longer has his wife. He is not assigned to the cavalry, which he actually he's very chagrined by. And Grant has a really hard time, and he becomes deeply depressed. And he gets a 2-month leave to go back when his kid is born, and when he has to go back to the military, he writes really sad parts about leaving his wife and leaving his friends. And Grant just becomes a really big alcoholic at the time. And it's actually really sad to read about this stuff. And when Grant gets back, again, I told you he freed the slave. His business ventures all fail. He ends up selling firewood on the streets of St. Louis to try to make ends meet. He just goes in the forest all day and chops wood. And he's just really depressed. And he's having this correspondence with Longstreet. Meanwhile, Longstreet's living it up. He's pretty wealthy, doing well. And John C. Calhoun writes his fire breather statements. And neither of them are neither Longstreet nor Grant are super political. They are tossed into a situation. I think we'll take a quick pause there, and we'll come back to that situation. So we left off with Longstreet and Grant, who were not uber political, being hoisted into a new situation. Obviously, that situation is what ends up happening in South Carolina. And there is now a civil war, and they have to choose a side. And there's actually correspondence between the two. Longstreet is very hesitant to fight at all. Longstreet he served under Scott in Mexico. And I just want to say that Lee also was very hesitant about fighting. And remember, Lee is actually approached to be head of the Union Army. It ends up being Scott, who is old and doesn't know anything about modern warfare when the time comes. But eventually, Longstreet joins the Confederate cause. And he fights under the Northern Army of Virginia as one of the generals under Lee. Lee is a very peculiar leadership style. Lee is a very hands-off as opposed to Braxton under the Army of Tennessee and Army of the West, who's much more hands-on. I think there's no doubt Lee was the much more successful general of the two Confederate big dogs. Longstreet was actually very, very good at environment battles. He understood landscape and topography much better than Lee did, much better than many generals in the Confederacy. He was not the best at unit movement, but he was still quite a good general. And actually, one of the things Longstreet is most famous for is warning Lee about Gettysburg. There's a lot of controversy about this, but Longstreet warns him about Pickett's charge, warns him about a number of movements at Gettysburg, and Lee does not listen to Longstreet. Obviously, that was for the Confederate cause, calamity at that point, which that alone does not cause, the Confederates were going to lose anyways, but that was a catalyst for much of that. And Longstreet is so mad after Gettysburg that he actually signs up to go fight under Braxton instead, where Braxton is much more hands-on, and Longstreet actually suffers what would be defeats. Again, I think it was inevitable at this point. The Union was going to win, especially as Grant starts coming in. They actually don't face each other until the Battle of the Wilderness, which ends up being a really, really bloody battle. And Longstreet actually is able to push his friend back when he gets there, but Longstreet actually comes late to the chagrin of the Northern Army of Virginia, but it actually catches the Union off foot, weirdly enough, so his mistake ends up being a big tactical advantage. Obviously, Longstreet gets injured at the Battle of Wilderness, and then they end up losing the entire war. They meet again at Appomattox, and when Grant invites them in, he asks for a special somebody, obviously, to come for the Confederate surrender. And it's, Lee's obviously going to be there, but he asks for Longstreet to be there. And Longstreet, they come in, and at this point, Lee still looks like the austere gentleman, but they come in rags. The Southerners have depleted almost everything they had. I mean, at the Battle of the Wilderness, there's talks about how the Confederates they started throwing rocks. They had no more ammunition to use, which is ironic because Longstreet actually gets shot by his own troops. So one of those precious bullets ends up shooting him. And they meet there, and Grant, this is where actually Grant at the beginning becomes so popular even with Southerners. He is so gracious to the Confederates who come through and allows all the Confederates to leave with their arms, which is a big deal back then, to not have to disarm yourself, to not have to, there's a manliness message that comes through, and they all shake hands, and the peace terms that Lincoln allows Grant to extend are nothing short of the most kind peace terms you could ever ask for. I mean, really, what had happened to other rebellions at times, normally, not only would Jeff Davis be beheaded, but Longstreet, Lee, everybody on down. And there would have been total, what later will be used, martial law of a place. The Union terms are so gracious, and I mean that very seriously, that Grant was a gentleman, a true gentleman to Lee and to Longstreet. And part of that had to do with his friendship with Longstreet. Even though they had battled against each other, even though when Grant crushed Vicksburg, even when Longstreet, there's a correspondence between them partially in the war. Longstreet's writing to his cousin, who Grant marries. It's like, what the hell are you doing? You're going to ruin your own family. And Grant responds as a gentleman. I mean, there really is a beautiful friendship. And when they meet, they actually embrace each other as old friends. I mean, again, they're part of the same class. They've known each other most of their lives. And these two men get to rebuild, who have come from different walks of life. Again, they're not uber political, which will end up haunting Grant later. He'll be sort of taken over what will then later be coined as the monopoly class, the prototypes of the Carnegies, who will start coming and sort of taking over Grant, which will tarnish his reputation later. They embrace, and Grant asks Longstreet to take over one of the greatest responsibilities of all time, and that's helping rehabilitate the South. There is this, and I'm skipping a little bit after Johnson and Lincoln, and I actually am going to talk about Lincoln at the end, who's one of the greatest American thinkers of all time. Grant trusts Longstreet to peacefully and nicely bring about the South. And Longstreet actually leads a mixed coalition of troops against a white rebellion in southern Tennessee. And Longstreet helps with what would be the beginnings of Reconstruction, but rather than merely just a martial law type thing, he actually brings in economic capabilities, and he's a direct ear to Grant. He's able to directly get aid. There ends up becoming a split in the South. Obviously, Reconstruction was very unpopular in lots of the South, mainly due to the bourgeois who had lost their power, people who had built their power. I'll use an example, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who had built up a power of Memphis and northern Mississippi. They were displaced, and they ended up founding and creating things, terror groups. Grant trusts Longstreet to help curtail that. And the problem Longstreet does is he economically is much more successful at rehabilitating the Carolinas, particularly the coasts where trade is good, and New Orleans. He ends up living in New Orleans, and he's able to rehabilitate those. He's not as successful in what I'll call the Deep South, Birmingham, Memphis, Jackson, Atlanta even, he's not as successful in rehabilitating those places. And I think that ends up hurting reconciliation. But it does bring, places like New Orleans that end up becoming these like absolute monuments and wonderful places of economic and might literature, philosophy that stem from them. They have a lot of Southern thought that come from these places. So Longstreet takes some good care of these places, but really fails parts and utterly fails Appalachia, who is just actually, not only does he fail that, but Reconstruction doesn't even touch Appalachia. So there's not even a chance for them to be really ruled. They just are economically left totally alone and isolated. And so these are actually kind of failures of Longstreet on that part. But I don't want to give him, you do need to give him his just dues that southern Louisiana, other port cities do prosper under Longstreet's stewardship. And Grant is, again, to many of these continued traitors and terrorists, Grant is very peaceful and very forgiving. And their friendship, even with disagreement, you have to understand Longstreet received death threats every single day by terror organizations. And their friendship is what kept this balance and kept another civil war from breaking out. Longstreet was able to hold the South together and keep it from breaking and keeping another civil war from emerging. And Grant's generosity and his ability to say, I'm a hands-off, this is going to hurt him. He says, I'll be a hands-off president and let you help sail the ship. Now this ends up cutting both ways. First, Grant is terrible with his money, absolutely horrendous. Second, Grant is hands-off to Longstreet, not just because of friendship, but because Grant is a very hands-off person from anything that isn't military. He doesn't want to be involved. He didn't want to be president, by the way. It's actually very much thrust upon him. He says, I never was a real politician. The only thing I ever even cared about was slavery. I guess I would be, a part of this, but he doesn't want to at all. In his administration, Reconstruction is so dilapidated. Parts of it are oppressive, parts of it are not. Parts of it are inconsistent throughout the South. He also lets the industrialists be quite powerful, which behooves some aspects of Congress. Sort of one of the notions, Congress has stayed wealthy throughout its entire history. They no longer had to fully serve in Congress. They could just pay, before Congress was filled with Virginia wealthy planters, the rich, no doubt. Well, now the good news is that the industrialists didn't have to actually run for office. They could just pay somebody, and they could just sit back in New York and chill. So that was nice for them. So Grant, I don't want to give the conception that he was a very nice man, and he was a brilliant military tactician and leader, very effective, as was Longstreet. They were not perfect by any means, but this difference of opinion, this friendship, lasted them through the bloodiest conflict on American soil that we've ever seen, and it's pretty amazing. Longstreet eventually gets rehabilitated, his reputation and name, by his second wife in the early 1900s. He's dead, but his second wife does that. I don't know. Grant gets mixed reviews throughout his life, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Abraham Lincoln. And I call these guys are the Roger Sherman and the George Clinton or the Monroe or the Patrick Henry of the second founding of America. What do I mean by the second founding of America? The second founding of America happens right after the Civil War. And it's a ratification of the ideals of the Constitution. The founders wrote about it. A lot of it's based off of Jefferson's written letters. And it's about how these rights apply to all Americans. Okay, the 14th Amendment. So 13th Amendment ends slavery. 14th Amendment says anybody born on American soil is an American and deserves all rights therein. That includes all the slaves who are there. Doesn't quite yet apply to women, but it applies to all men in the United States, regardless of religion, regardless of race. And this is so important. It's why it's coined the second founding of the United States. A lot of this is, again, based off of Jefferson's, Madison's, and Adams' works, where they recognized a lot of what they were doing was needed to be reckoned with one day. And I think this was set in stone by a man born in Kentucky in a log cabin who grew up in Indiana in the wilderness and then moved to Illinois to make some money. And that was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's family was displaced out of Kentucky because of slavery. His dad did not believe in it, and they economically lost out. They were the losers, and they ended up moving to Indiana. Abraham Lincoln, a lot of his parents died when he was young, but he taught himself to read and write. He worked on the farm for his father, and he was very devoutly religious. Something he bonded about with Grant is he memorized passages of the Bible and would read it. It was the only book they had in their home. Lincoln would teach himself. He was really into wrestling, which is really random. Really loved to wrestle. For those of you, I know that it's now popular. What do you do? Jiu-jitsu? Is that like he very much believed in the idea of one has to be. There's a very big purpose for athleticism, and even if it's just taking a walk, and there's a big purpose for feeding the brain too. And Lincoln really, really believed in that stuff. And Lincoln was, he taught himself to read and write, ends up memorizing the Bible, ends up going to school. He's not college educated. He ends up studying the law at first on his own. And he ends up, he too was he filled out a myriad of jobs. He worked as a blacksmith for a little while, a carpenter. He apparently tried to be a tailor in his third cousin's shop and sucked because he had really big hands. He was not a good tailor, so he's fired. And he eventually ends up becoming a lawyer because that's what one does when they fail at a lot of things. And he ends up becoming decently successful, and he runs for the state legislature and wins. He then tries to run for governor and loses. And he eventually ends up in Congress and does exceedingly well. He's a gifted speaker. And Lincoln ends up, and I'm sorry, I know I'm going quickly. He ends up, do you have a question or no? No. Okay. He ends up eventually winning the election, partially due to a split in the vote, because there's a famous Tennessean who runs, and then there are other folks who run. The presidential race ends up being quite populated. And then the South secedes when Lincoln wins. Lincoln's a Republican, and the party stance is obviously anti-slavery, certainly anti-growth of slavery for sure. And Lincoln, he was really quite a good first reader of other people. He had to let Scott be the first leader because of his work in the Mexican-American War. There was political pressure. Scott sucked. I mean, just sucked. He was fighting. I mean, it was like when the Prussians fought the French when Napoleon was there. I mean, so woefully behind and outdated, they couldn't measure. And Lee was such a better tactician. Even Braxton was a better tactician than Scott at that time. The Confederates were much better at using guerrilla warfare, not true guerrilla warfare, but a form of it. The Union still believed in their superior firepower. Lining up in lines would do the trick. It did not. And the Union, Scott was a huge fan of cavalry rushes, and he would rush right into Confederate artillery from long distances, not even up close. But Scott believed in the gallant man in the cavalry charge, and a lot of actually young, well-to-do men who were in the Union cavalry died at the beginning of the war, which really stymied the Union's efforts to win quickly, which they thought. I mean, some of you might know, I mean, the first few battles were actually literally watched by onlookers for entertainment because they thought it was going to be so fast, so quick, the Confederates would lose so quickly, and they were so flabbergasted when not only did the Confederates win, but it was so bloody. I mean, horrific, horrific battles. And this was people like Longstreet and Grant killing each other. My direct family fought on one side, but I have cousins who fought on both sides of the war. Many Americans, families were split. There are stories, whether or not these are fully true. There was he was a lieutenant for the Confederates, and he sent his son up to be educated in the North. They're at the Battle of Collierville, and he shoots somebody who says don't shoot, and it ends up being his son. I doubt that that's true, but there are numerous actual occasions of brother killing brother, cousin killing cousin, especially from the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland. Pretty horrific. Scott County here, Knox County here. A lot of fighting. Even Davidson County, I mean, there was a lot of, Sam Houston, governor of Tennessee, was a strong unionist, and was basically kicked out of the state. Legendary man, also, semi-pioneer, frontiersman to an extent. It was a lot of brother against brother, and pretty horrific fighting. And these two, I think, embolize that at a larger picture. And there's a lot more paperwork to read about them than there are others. Lincoln saw that and was very disgusted. And it's actually why he had Grant help pick Sherman. Sherman's very famous for his March to the Sea, which I think everybody here knows about to an extent. And it really was a total warfare march across the South to the Atlantic. And Lincoln writes about how sad he is that had to happen, but he views it as something that did need to happen to end the war as quickly as possible. And there's accounts at Gettysburg. I mean, many of you know the famous speech he gave upon these hollow grounds. He really meant it, and he was really sad watching all these people just fucking die, who were cousins, and also it economically destroyed the United States. It set us back generations, and it ultimately created a horrific split in the South. Lincoln was filled with lamentation about it. When he writes the Emancipation Proclamation, there's no doubt Lincoln was anti-slavery, for sure, wholly through. He'll tell you from his own writings that he obviously fought the Civil War to hold and preserve the Union. Slavery was important to him. He also used that as a very effective tool in warfare. The Emancipation Proclamation helped set up black units. Actually, there's a very famous battle that Nathan Bedford Forrest took part in against a black unit that is the study of many controversies. But Lincoln was very, very smart and was able to coalesce this, and he certainly believed in emancipation. I mean, there's no doubt he was very anti-slavery. And then when the war is ending, Lincoln is the one who tells Grant's a soldier, he's got to do what the president says. Lincoln is the one who has the generous terms. Lincoln believes in a Reconstruction. I'm happy, Johnson is not part of my talk, but I'm happy to talk about him. But Lincoln believes in Reconstruction, but he definitely believes in mercy and grace to all of the South. I think there's probably not a greater, more complex figure in American history than him, or pretty damn close. There's an order that's issued by the Supreme Court having to do with habeas corpus. Basically a form of sentencing for judges, that the Supreme Court says you cannot suspend it, Lincoln, unilaterally. Congress needs to agree to that. Lincoln, taking words from Jackson, basically says, you've made your order, I see that, you go ahead and try to enforce that. Lincoln ignores it's a per curiam opinion, which is a little different than a full Supreme Court order. Per curiam means only one justice wrote it for emergency posture. But he ignores it, which is a big deal. It's one of the very first times in history a president ignores a Supreme Court order. Lincoln, especially in Maryland, cracked down on freedom of speech. Now, Lincoln is a part of a pool, and I think this will be different when we compare him to Longstreet or Grant. Lincoln is part of a pool almost to the extent that the ends justify the means. And I would say that Jefferson and Adams are similarly a part of that pool. You then have people like Longstreet, Grant, Madison, who believe in the processes and the procedures, and that's what makes us. That those protections, that Sixth Amendment, that right to counsel, the right to a jury trial, that's what makes us special, not the ends justify the means. Lincoln, Adams, and Jefferson did not believe that, just so you know. But there was a compromise that happened. And Lincoln was not the lone figure at the second founding. When he made this idea that we are created and that we are all equal, and that we all deserve equal representation in the law, and we all have equal powers before it. And then he's assassinated, and Johnson does a bang-up job. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to very quickly peruse through, but I know that we have, I don't think the lunch is at 1, but does anyone have questions? Otherwise, I'll go back and fill in things or carry on with Johnson. I can carry on with Johnson. I can go back. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I guess briefly, to what extent do you think Lincoln's Reconstruction happens in a different way is because of ideological differences, or a more economic because when you read some of the stuff that they originally planned to do, it sort of sounds more like the literal word reconstruction. There's a lot of plans for roads and economic development, and most of that doesn't happen.
Correct.
Why do you think that is? Is it just they don't have money, or?
I think there are multiple reasons. One, Lincoln was just a great planner. Again, he really was a brilliant man. Two, I think Johnson stymied a lot of this stuff. Johnson actually was a good guy, should never have been put in that situation, and did a horrible job. Johnson actually did try to hold the Union, and he did not pardon at first every Confederate. Lincoln wrote to do that, but Johnson did wait, and he wanted to make sure the Southerners swore fealty again back to the Constitution. Johnson also was an alcoholic, did not take criticism well, and he ruined a lot of the early efforts. And when Grant got in, Grant did take Lincoln's notes, and that's why he appointed Longstreet. And Longstreet did a great job rebuilding New Orleans and Charleston, where there were economic powers already. And they rebuilt streets there, helped with progress in ports. But yeah, I mean, they've entirely failed the entire middle section of the South. Longstreet was not a city planner, was not an economic developer. He was a soldier. And he knew some port stuff and Navy stuff that he could talk to friends about. Also, it's really easy to rebuild New Orleans and Charleston when they were not utterly destroyed and they are on great positions. Whereas it's much harder to rebuild Jackson, Mississippi, or Vicksburg, Mississippi, or certainly anywhere in Appalachia that had no foundation for any of this stuff. I mean, the Tri-Cities, all this stuff had nothing, and Grant was too busy also with other affairs. At this time, Grant was sort of depressed by criticism at this point. Grant obviously has depression, in case anybody was wondering. And he also is just kind of a very hands-off president, which is actually what a lot of founders envisioned the president to be, but people were unhappy when they found out that the president was not always steering the ship and that Longstreet was steering the South, part of the South. And other characters were particularly the beginnings of the steel and mill movements who became and the beginnings of mining power also. So that became really quite strong. The train cars in Chicago, the meat freeze packers that just started in the 1870s. I think Grant and Longstreet were hopelessly overwhelmed at a certain, and so they did not build any roads. I mean, the dirt road between Memphis and Nashville was better pre the Civil War than it was post, and it was never. I mean, it's not until Wilson and then really FDR where the South is actually rebuilt. Aside from, again, I don't want to say, Charleston and New Orleans, parts of Florida, tangentially Memphis and Atlanta and Nashville have a different history. The bigger cities recovered much more successfully, but because they had commerce beforehand. I mean, there was a writing, Memphis was stricken by yellow fever. Memphis was peered at Atlanta pre the Civil War, and it was obviously the cotton capital, big trade hub of the Deep South, and Memphis was stricken by yellow fever. And the Memphis leadership and Shelby County leadership wrote to Grant to ask for money and support. Apparently Grant never got the letter. So we don't know why or how that happened, but there was a lot of disorganization. So I do think Grant was probably a good president for the time and to fill the spot. I'm not sure who would have done a better job, but you did probably need Lincoln the same way you needed Truman. There was something about having that person who steered the ship to continue doing it, at least for a little bit. And Truman filled a void. It would have been remarkable if Johnson could have been the Truman to FDR and Lincoln to fill the comparison. But Truman filled the shoes that Johnson could not. And Grant, I think Grant did the best he could. I think he actually did a decent job. I'm not so sure that other politicians at the time were up to the task and would have been as successful. Henry Clay's nephew, he was a blowhard. I mean, a lot of these guys were either so ideological and not willing to. I mean, you have some fire breathers in the South who were asking for a second secession. You had terror groups in the South, and you had the radical Republicans in the North. These not just intense abolitionists, but believed in hanging all the Confederates. It was a really tough time, and I think Grant did the best he could. And he also got to the game late. That's a really good question, though. Anybody else? Yeah?
It's a question that's maybe a little tangential. So the characters and the relationships between Longstreet, Grant, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, is most of this something that later historians have gone back and then reconstructed it, or was it something that you would have a media or some other broader understanding that this was occurring at that time? Because now, obviously, the relationships are obfuscated by propaganda and sensation, but we do have the public follows quite closely these sorts of interactions and relationships. And I'm wondering if the public was completely oblivious to it, or slightly aware, or very aware.
That's a great question. So these two, they're very aware. There's actually political cartoons and maligning them. There's a picture, it's Longstreet, he's big, and Grant is very tiny, sitting on Longstreet's lap, and Longstreet's petting him, and it just says, "The South making us eat soup." And Grant's crying, and Longstreet's comforting baby Grant. And these two were famously known, but to the others, Jefferson and Adams were not known at the time, that they reconciled. It was known that they hated each other. Basically, Adams imprisoned Jefferson's chief of staff, but not his chief publicist, who had the newspaper company. I guess there was public know-how of their hate, but there was very little public know-how of people when they reconciled. Like Patrick Henry in Washington, when I talked about, when Washington begged Patrick Henry to quell the Virginians, that was not public. And some of them, I mean, Washington was more private, Madison was more private, Adams more private, Jefferson was more open than them.
So to some extent, though, that drama was unfolding in the public eye. A sub-question on that then, how much of that was sensation as opposed to legitimate gripes? I imagine that a lot of the information you're talking about is coming from personal letters and other inside accounts, but again, I'm trying to think of it through the lens of our own time. It would be, Trump and Musk, blah, 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 blah.
Sure.
Like it's, yes, these things are occurring, but also they're occurring under the shadow of a lot of propaganda and media spin.
I think it's a really good question. For some of it, there was certainly media spin. I think there was a real vitriol at some of them, like Burr and Hamilton had a real vitriol. So there was some of it there. I think some of it with Adams was really particularly played up because a lot of people really hated Adams. He was just kind of an asshole. He really was. He was like this short, balding, big-nosed, chubby dude who was just kind of mean-spirited. Again, very smart. And
religiously self-righteous.
Very self-righteous. He was one of those holier than thou, I know better than you. The media did play up a lot of his stuff to make him look bad. It's probably doubtful he hated Madison as much. I do think the media was sensationalizing their relationship. I think he and Jefferson were sincerely bitter. The media largely ignored Madison and Washington's, which was publicly known, but the media decided to quell it. I don't know why. Probably would they assume stability, but the media was very scared to publish critiques of Washington. That was probably part of it. So the media would choose to censor some things on their own. Adams' administration, obviously, the media was censored in general. But that's a great question. I mean, so sometimes it was, for some I just don't know, especially with some of the more Northeast leadership. I mean, George Clinton is a good, Monsieur of New York, another good one, Roger Sherman. It's just harder, and I'm much more familiar with the Virginians. That's a great question, though. And if you find out the answer to the rest of it, the only ones I know are Jefferson, Adams, Madison, the big, those ones. But for the other ones, I'd be very interested to know. So that's a great question. I'm sorry I couldn't answer that better.
No, it actually clarifies a lot.
Yeah.
Are there any books you would recommend as far as examining the relationship with Longstreet and Grant, or any other biographical material we can look into?
Grant's biography is a great one. I highly recommend it. It's very interesting. Longstreet, there is a biography of Longstreet. There's also a good, I can't remember who, there's a mini series on him on YouTube. I cannot remember who does it. I watched it a long time ago, but I remember enjoying it. I would say Grant's biography. There's another.
Who's the author?
I can Google it. It's the one that came out.
He has an autobiography that's very good as well.
Grant. Yeah.
I got you.
So Grant has an autobiography that's actually pretty good. There's a biography that recently came out, though. I want to say in the last 20 years or so. That's probably more honest than the autobiography and is pretty good. I can tell you the author. If my phone will load.
Yeah.
When it loads, I will tell you. There's another book that's called The Good Military Gentleman by Brian Steele. He was a Emory grad, actually, and he writes about just basically all these guys who were in class together. They're all within almost 4 years of each other, who are a lot of them end up becoming military leaders in the Confederacy, but a number of them in the Union, and all of them go to the Mexican-American War as junior officers, because there are a lot of them actually, which is very weird. A lot of times the local leadership, like Nathan Bedford Forrest, for example, was just a militia leader. And he ends up mostly staying in West Tennessee and northern Mississippi. But there are a number of officers who all served together who like were roommates. And more Confederacy, but still a number of Union. And they all knew each other and were friends, which is really crazy. So that's going by Brian Steele that I
Gotcha.
definitely recommend. I'm trying to think of other good Civil War pieces. There's another one by Brian Steele, which is called Nathan Bedford Forrest, which is about the western frontier and obviously about Nathan Bedford Forrest. But it talks about Braxton a lot, was a decent man, but not a very good general. I'm sure there are worse. He had a very hands-on military style, which for some worked. That's a pretty good book. That's also Brian Steele Mills. I'm trying to think of another good.
You find that like McPherson's history is like good.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's definitely decent. If you like real nitty-gritty Civil War books, and I say this as a Memphian, so you have to forgive me, but Shelby Foote is probably the best writer of the Civil War. But it's very long.
What did you write?
He wrote the Civil War.
Yeah.
It is a 3-book odyssey. I'm saying each one is like 3,000 pages.
Yeah.
I read the first 2. I skimmed the 3rd because it is an endeavor of love. He also appears on like a lot of documentaries. I think the most famous one is the Ken Burns PBS One Civil War. I just highly recommend anything that he talks or writes. He's kind of a Faulkner-esque goes on, but he is a fun read. And for the Civil War, probably the best, most detailed account of like battle per battle of anybody. And he does a great job talking about all of these guys, especially Longstreet. At his time, at Shelby Foote's time, 80s and previously, especially when the Lost Cause narrative was so popular, Longstreet and even Lee to an extent were maligned. Foote does a good job rehabilitating them. Lee's glorified right after the Civil War, and he ends up going back. He's in his own way a Cincinnatus. He ends up going and teaching at Washington College, which later became Washington Lee. And he actually has a quiet life, and he doesn't want to be involved in politics, and he does a good job of being a demonstration to the Southern elites to stop. He, later in the 1920s, particularly right after when Birth of a Nation comes out, is seen as a loser. And there's a split in what's called the Lost Cause narrative, which is a theory, an incorrect theory about the South's role in the Civil War. And there are sort of 2 thought pools. One of them glorifies Lee, one of them absolutely hates Lee. And Foote does a good job rehabilitating. I highly recommend Shelby Foote. Brian Steele Mills is also really good. I definitely recommend both of them for Civil War stuff. Yeah. And I'll make one book suggestion, and it's not Civil War, it's Founders. I have to tell you the best Founders book is probably The 3 Lives of James Madison by Noah Feldman. Absolutely. It obviously focuses on Madison, but it goes through all of the founders, and it talks about the adaptation and arguments of the Constitution. It has some of Madison's notes. Madison didn't change any of his notes. Jefferson famously, when he realized that it was going to be a library and he was going to donate, edited his notes, which he didn't want people to see everything he wrote. And look, we're all human. Sometimes I'm sure he wrote like, I had to take a shit, and I'm sitting in this meeting and it's really hot and I'm tired. And he edits parts of it. But the only 2 people who take real notes at remember Jefferson's not there, but at the Constitutional Convention is Madison and Hamilton. For some reason, a room full of brilliant people, allegedly nobody else took notes, which is wild. Like, I don't know how the Adams family and all these brilliant people sat there, Washington, all these people who sat, Franklin, and nobody thought to take notes.
I think we need to ask Pam Bondi to release the notes.
Gotta have Pam Bondi released. I'm sure part of it had to do with them being fearful if it was discovered. They didn't want everybody to find it and stuff. And I'm sure things were burned. I'm sure more people took notes.
They burned them or
Yeah.
ate them.
Yeah, whatever it was, or even just sold them. I mean, that was very common. Some of the founders had a lifestyle they wanted to keep, but back then when you served in Congress, it was a gentleman's club and you were not paid, so they would write things and sell them, and sell original copies. So I'm sure that all of those were the result of that. But that is probably one of the best books on the founders, and I highly recommend that book. There's a great book by Patrick. Again, I really like Patrick Henry. There's a book that's called Patrick Henry, which was written by who's the agrarian from Vandy? Is it Edsel? Thomas Edsel? I can't remember. I think there's only one biography about Patrick Henry, anyways. I want to say it's Thomas Edsel. It's one of the Vanderbilt agrarian political philosophers from the early 1900s. I just cannot remember the author, but that's a great book too. Yeah, and nowadays too, I don't listen to them, but I hear that there are a lot of good podcasts and stuff. I'm like woefully ignorant on. I'll defer to some other gentlemen who are more versed in media and things than myself. Thanks, y'all. Thank you.